Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar, The EU's Balancing Act, Navigating Trade Tensions with China and the US in the Era of Trump 2.0. My name is Lizzi Lee. I'm a fellow on Chinese economy at Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis, and it's my pleasure to guide you through today's discussion. As we kick off the new year, the EU finds itself in an increasingly challenging position, with President Trump back in the White House pushing an aggressive trade agenda and potential escalating tensions with China over tariffs and also tech transfer demands. Today, we'll explore how Europe can strike this delicate balance between strategic autonomy, economic security, and its relationships with two of its largest trading partners. To help us unpack these complex dynamics, we are joined by three exceptional experts. First, we have Wendy Cutler, Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute. We also have Joerg Wuttke, partner at ASG Group and the longtime president of EU Chamber of Commerce in China. And finally, we have Ilaria Mazzocco, a senior fellow at the CSIS. Thank you so much for being here. And let's dive right into the discussion. I'm going to start by looking at a recent development. We generally expected some immediate trade moves against China, but they didn't materialize on day one of President Trump's second term. Does that mean there will be this window of reprieve, possibly setting the stage for direct talks between President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping? With this slower approach to tariffs, it seems, could we see a different President Trump this time around? So Wendy, what's your take? Is President Trump 2.0 showing us something new?
Well, we're seeing some recurring themes. He likes tariffs. He doesn't like trade deficits. And he believes that many of our old existing trade agreements just promoted unfairness between our trading partners and wants to correct them. He has added a new twist on tariffs, and that is that they will be revenue producing and therefore can help finance the tax cut. So those are some of the similarities. But what we're seeing this time, in my view, is a much better organized team. He has already nominated loyal appointees to carry out this agenda, and he's filling the slots quickly. I think finally his executive order on trade and tech and investment underscores that trade is going to be a key focus for him. It's not going to be limited to China or Europe. It's going to also include Mexico and Canada and other countries with large bilateral trade deficits.
Fantastic. And Ilaria, that's also your view?
Yeah, I think we knew from the campaign that there were at least three priorities for the incoming Trump team and Trump himself. One was immigration, one was trade, and one was sort of government reform, right? The DOGE project. And I think we've seen the executive orders sort of reflect that, right? We've seen some pretty muscular action on sort of immigration and certainly on trade. And as you know, I think as Wendy said, it's not just China, right? And so I think actually if you were a China watcher, you were expecting sort of day one to be about China. But I think if you were watching the broader scheme of things, it's not surprising that Mexico and Canada have been the first target. Or the clearest target, because I think that's part of sort of a strategy on the USMCA renegotiation, which is going to be sort of, I think a big topic of conversation in Washington over the course of this year. Now, does this mean that Trump has gone soft on China? I don't think so. I don't think China is not, still a priority. And we've heard that, Trump would like to go to China. There's been he announced that he would like to introduce tariffs on China, 10% tariffs on China, so much lower than I think previously have been discussed. But that's, I think we're seeing that Trump is sort of gearing up to go into negotiating mode. Now, what's the negotiation going to be about? What are going to be the objectives? I think that's sort of an interesting question. But I agree with Wendy that we're seeing a very, a team that's learned a lot from the previous experience And I think they're much more prepared and are going in already with very clear objectives.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And Wendy, let me turn back to you. From Trump 1.0, we know his approach often involves exerting pressures on US allies to align with his policies. So how is China responding to this dynamic? Are we seeing any notable shifts in economic incentives, diplomatic strategies, policy priorities as Beijing recalibrates its approach to these traditional US allies?
Well, like the US this time, I think also China and our other trading partners are much more prepared for what might happen in Trump 2.0 than they were the first time around. And for China in particular, it has spent the past few years reducing its reliance on the United States, either through working with other trading partners, but also, frankly, in boosting self-sufficiency at home. It has also put into place a framework of legal tools that it could use, including the unreliable entities list, the sanctions regulation, and other, again, other legal instruments. But in answer to your question, another instrument that I fully expect them to use is what I call an affirmative agenda, trying to improve relations with particularly US partners and allies that might feel threatened or unhappy with what Trump is doing, and giving them preferential access to the Chinese market, which, in reality, then puts the US at the disadvantage. So it still is punitive against the United States, but it's framed in an affirmative way. And we're seeing this already with China offering or relaxing its visa requirements, taking off some sectors from its negative list for investment opportunities, and establishing free trade zones and pilot projects around the country. And also, it is looking to solve some thorny issues with trading partners. And here I bring Japan to the forefront because the Fukushima seafood import dispute has been top of agenda. And it seems like that is being constructively worked on, where China might relax some of those requirements soon. So I think we're going to see this not only vis-a-vis the EU, but other trading partners. But I also think that it's much more complicated than that, and you can't really buy off trading partners just with incentives, particularly given that China has a number of other restrictions in place, whether it be data or security or restrictions on activities of executives in China that can undermine all of these market opening incentives. And when you put on top of it a slowing Chinese economy, I'm not sure how alluring these incentives or new programs or new initiatives will be for our trading partners. But let me just conclude and say they are also trying to hedge their bets here. And they're worried about what Trump might do. And if it looks like they're going to be shut out of the US market, guess what? They need other markets for their products to go to.
Fantastic. And, George, as both Ilaria and Wendy mentioned, President Trump's trade wars are not just about bilateral tariffs. They actually have shockwaves, sent shockwaves through the global economy. From your perspective, what are the most significant implications of US-China trade tensions for the EU, especially in areas like tariffs and investment flows, as you very helpfully highlighted during our pre-show discussions?
I think one underreported side effect is that the EU will try to have deeper and meaningful relationship with those countries that are getting into trouble with the US. Just 4 days before Trump got into office, Mexico and European Union signed a global agreement for the economy, broadening the free trade agreements they had in the past between European Union and Mexico. I think that will be a theme that actually Europe is trying to, with Mercosur in December, trying to reach out to trading partners, assuming that maybe exports from Europe into the US will be challenged, as it was last time. The ripple-on effect we have, of course, from the US closing out the Chinese product is there will be more Chinese products floating around the world trying to find markets. And of course, that puts more pressure on trading partners, because where are these cars, where are these machines are going to go? There are not many economies the size of the US, and that's sort of Europe is the ending point. So we will see more overcapacities floating into the European Union, putting pressure on our politicians to come up with dumping cases and the likes. The ripple-on effect in technology is going to be quite severe, because the US clearly has indicated that if there are Chinese components, Chinese software in some machine buildings, equipment, then all of a sudden they might not be able to sell anymore into the US market. The word that I learned, I'm here now since 6 months in the US, the word I learned when I started here is, for example, cyber booby trap, assuming that the Chinese are able to turn off cranes, wind turbines and solar panels from afar in case they want to. And of course, that will then mean that America will look at European products very differently, because in every of these European products, there is some Chinese component and Chinese software in there. The ripple-on effect will mean that we are becoming more into a silo. The European Chamber just published a paper beginning of this month in Beijing, and it says, there will be more silos in the economy, which of course is not very good for globalization, and certainly not good for American or European consumers. So it's getting more complex at a time when Chinese economy is limping along and actually not in good shape. So is Europe, so in a way it will be quite a tough business outlook for 2025.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for giving us that overview on EU-China relationship, which is also fraught with its own challenges. So George, you mentioned overcapacity. I wanted to go back to that point a little more. We've seen China's overcapacity issues span from steel industry, textile industry in global trade, and now it's cropping up in newer areas like EVs and solar tech. So what has changed this time, and how might these new overcapacity challenges shape EU's economy in 2025 and beyond?
Well, I did a report in 2009. That was exactly when the great financial crisis happened globally, and China faced overcapacities in aluminum and steel and so forth, refinery. But China could print its way out of this problem, and they absorbed all of these internal overcapacities. It came back again in 2015-16. I did a second report at that time, indicating the challenges it has done, is particular on the Chinese economy. People always see the overcapacity issue as a trade tension thing, but it is deeply corrosive for the Chinese economy. Basically, they are sort of not really grew out of it, but they could do something because the pockets were still deep and they had money in order to bail out companies and keep them going. This time, the overcapacity, you don't have the money anymore, you don't have the growth anymore, you cannot grow out of it easily, and it requires market consolidation in order to actually safeguard the Chinese economy, first and foremost. And of course, this incredible overcapacity goes into exports. The Chinese have gone now from steel, aluminum to a different kind of steel. I mean, a car that is now added to the mix, and that's the problem that we're facing right now. China can export 1 million cars a year more than they had in the past. So in a way, overcapacity is something where, of course, Beijing lives in denial. There is no overcapacity. That's a new dimension as well. But it has to be tackled. And 2025, I guess the theme there on overcapacity will be market consolidation. In China, you cannot have 140 car brands forever. And the second will be trade tensions also with the global south. Countries like Thailand, Brazil, that actually have car productions will partly close their borders for the Chinese exports.
Fantastic. And Ilaria, you and your colleague at CSIS did some fantastic study on this issue. So let's dig a little deeper here. How do you think the implications for overcapacity differ for the EU compared to the United States? Are we seeing unique trade dynamics of policy responses emerging from Brussels that's different from the US approach?
Yeah, I think, the European Union faces a couple, actually, I would say like at least three different challenges, right? One is trade diversion, right, as Joerg just mentioned. then potentially less access to the U.S. market for European European producers. And then more and more challenges in third markets, right? So, you're seeing more, you're going to probably see more trade diversion both towards Europe from China if their, Chinese producers cannot access as easily the American market. And then you're going to see a lot more competition in third markets, which, for example, Mercosur, right? There's not just going to be European products that are going to be flowing there. It's also going to be a lot of Chinese products. So I think that's going to be a big challenge. In addition to that, I think a big trend that's happening is that all around the world, you're seeing many countries that have their own industrial bases and industrial ambitions put up tariffs, but they're also all extremely interested in Chinese foreign direct investment. So you're seeing a bit of a race right now to attract that investment. It's very clear in Europe, I think, especially in the automotive sector. And it does risk creating a situation of a bit of a race to the bottom. It also is a question of just how much foreign direct investment in these sectors Chinese companies can provide, especially if some of them are not even actually profitable at this moment. So I think it's a huge opportunity, but I think there's also a lot of questions as to exactly which one of these companies are actually going to be able to provide sort of durable, reliable foreign direct investment. And I think that's going to be a really interesting dynamic to watch. I think it's also interesting that some of these firms, BYD being actually probably the best Chinese EV company and one that's actually been successful in terms of actually creating profits, they've been internationalizing extremely rapidly all over the world, Europe as well as other places. And I think they're starting to get their first hiccups, right? So actually their production, the plant that they're building in Brazil came under investigation due to violations. That doesn't mean they're going to fail, but I think it points to the complexity. And so I think that creates new challenges for Europe as European countries are competing against each other to attract these investments, but they're also competing with countries outside the European Union. And I think then, we can talk more about it, but it creates sort of a broader challenge for Europe as to maintaining its own unity vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis the United States, versus, the sort of internal competition that's always sort of present within the European Union.
Fantastic. We'll come back to the unity point later on. But speaking of challenges, Wendy, turning to another flashpoint, EU's tariffs on Chinese EVs have also sparked backlash from Beijing, with countermeasures adding fuel to the fire, so to speak. Do you think there's actual room for practical solutions here, such as alternative mechanisms to solve those issues, price undertakings? Are we going to get past this impasse, or is this something unavoidable?
Yeah, before I answer that question, let me just add on to what was said previously, just to show how complicated all of this is, because I think in Trump 2.0, we're going to see not only tariffs against direct imports from China, but I also think we are going to see restrictions on imports from Chinese companies in third country markets. How that's actually implemented is going to be complicated. There are different tools that can be used, but I think that's something that we all need to pay attention to, and is going to add, again, just another layer of complexity on all these trends for the coming year. Now, with respect to whether there's room for some kind of accommodation between the EU and China on the electric vehicle dispute, look, it's a work in progress. Negotiations are underway for what are called in the trade world kind of price undertaking agreements. This is a tool that the EU has used previously in other sectors. It's WTO legal. But I think this time around, it's just, again, more complicated in that it's an extremely important sector. Different member states have different equities in this dispute. And issues like foreign direct investment and technology transfer for Chinese companies that come to the EU is also under discussion as part of this deal. In addition, having then China back off some of the cognac retaliation it's put in place and some of the investigations it's launched kind of as a tit for tat. So I think there is room. I think talks at a technical level technically are still underway, but I think it would need a political push from either side to get this move, to get some kind of deal moving. The EU may also be a bit concerned that on how Trump may view any such deal with China, which also may make it more cautious this time around. But coming out of Davos, I sense there will be a series of high-level meetings between the EU and China. And whenever I hear about high-level meetings, then the next thing everyone's looking for are deliverables. And so who knows, maybe we will see an accommodation in the coming year. But I'd be interested in the views of the other panelists on the prospects for success here.
Right. Well, thank you so much. And you actually bring us naturally to the broader strategic picture that we will talk about next. And, the EU has been pretty vocal about its commitment to strategic autonomy. But as you mentioned, the path is anything but straightforward. So there, I'm going to turn to you next. We know Europe is juggling a lot right now, managing energy concerns from the Ukraine crisis, staying competitive in the global economy, and also maintaining political unity or stability across the bloc. So how do these competing priorities influence the bloc's strategies in dealing with what I would call the dual challenges of President Trump's return and EU's evolving relationship with China?
Well, Europe is not in a good spot right now. We need the engine, Paris and Berlin, and that is stuttering. We have elections in Germany coming up next month, and maybe after that we have a more clear idea of what Germany wants. I must say that at this stage, Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, has actually the biggest say in the whole thing, and she actually pushed these tariffs over the finishing line against Berlin's wishes. And that showcased that maybe it's the time for Europe in order to follow the lead, in particular on trade coming out of the Berlin Wall. But the biggest challenge will be, of course, what will the US do to Europe? The German cars used to be a security risk, and steel and so forth. And we have seen that China makes nice words towards Europe. But at the same time, we see no real tangible action. That's exactly what happened also last time under Trump 1.0. Everybody was asking me, does Europe have an advantage vis-a-vis the American companies? And I could only say no. Actually, we had very little, if at all. And I think that is the second time now around that China will make rhetoric and overtures towards Europe. But again, two things. One is they can't deliver. I'm there totally with Wendy. And the second is the Chinese market is far less alluring than it was 8 years ago. They have challenges in areas which are of interest to us. And on top of it, they go global and take on European companies in the global south. The US is just by any measure far more interesting for European companies than China is, frankly, right now. And hence, I guess also Europe will talk to the Chinese primarily also because of Ukraine. But on market issues, the game has really changed. The US is so much more important to European business as investors as well as traders.
Fantastic. And Ilaria, I'm going to come back to you. You mentioned political unity and the challenge of the bloc to sort of, have a united front, so to speak, when it comes to trade issues with China. Can you sort of elaborate on that a little more? How do you see that dynamics play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think Europe right now faces a lot of different challenges, right? Trade is just one of them. And I think, the Draghi report was a big wake-up call about the broader internal sort of economic challenges, ease of business, how the cost of energy is impacting manufacturing competitiveness in Europe, the future of innovation in Europe, right? The digital revolution has perhaps left the European Union a little bit behind. So I think there's multiple issues and thinking going on in Europe right now about, how to improve its competitiveness. And then trade is obviously sort of central to that because it sort of potentially could be the make it or break it moment for a lot of European companies. But I think, and obviously the United States is going to be crucial in the sense that there have been these ongoing challenges with China, but now we know that there's probably going to be even bigger challenges coming out of, or not bigger, but new challenges coming out of Washington. And I think von der Leyen just gave a really interesting speech. I think a couple of days ago at the World Economic Forum, and I think this was her first speech after the inauguration here in Washington. And it really, I think, reflected sort of the thinking on how the European Union as an institution needs to rebalance itself or reinvent itself for this new era, right? It's sort of a product of the era in which globalization seemed to be unstoppable. And she was sort of reflecting on that and how the challenges have changed. And now you see sort of this balancing act where old partners are no longer the partners they used to be. The European Union needs to think much more about its role in defense. It needs to, and it needs to balance its position vis-a-vis China. So I think, what's interesting is that you've seen more and more of this talk of certain recognition that decoupling is not possible from China. And so, really, but also that de-risking is necessary. So Europe's finding its own path when it comes to China is going to be difficult, as I said, because of the unity issue, because there's different interests, right? And I think we've been all saying this, right? There are different interests, there's different economic interests, different political interests. They're coming from different capitals. But I do agree that generally there is some skepticism vis-a-vis China, and I think Ukraine continues to be a real sort of thorn in the side of China as it tries to engage more with Europe.
Right. So Larry, I wanted to follow up on that a little bit. As you alluded to, Europe's political climate is also undergoing significant changes. It's not just the United States changing which party is in the White House, with a rising populism and also diverging approaches to globalization. How might these political climates or political shifts shape EU-China relations and EU's role in global trade, especially in such a volatile geopolitical environment?
So one thing I would highlight is that unlike in the US, China is not the top issue that European politicians deal with. And I think, I was trying to point to that I think there's other issues before China comes up. The trade issue is important, and now increasingly you hear talk about the investment issue. But China is not necessarily the first thing that policy makers in Europe are thinking of, even the populist ones. And in fact, even populist ones might have, not very different positions on China, or maybe even more friendly ones in some cases. But yes, absolutely, the political situation in Europe might change very significantly over the next year, right? I think France and Germany, there's a lot of question marks, and I'm looking forward to hearing what the views might be on the outcome of the German election. I'm from Italy. I think it's a surprise to everyone, Italians included, that the Italian government seems to be one of the most stable ones in Europe right now, right? And Giorgia Meloni seems like she may be one of the main interlocutors for the Europe, certainly in Washington, but potentially even looking east towards China. So I think this is definitely a new environment, and I think the European economic and defense situation are going to be shaping the outcomes of these elections, and as well as be impacted by how these elections go. But I'm not going to make predictions on German elections or French political stability.
Right, but George, let's touch on the upcoming German elections. When we think of Germany as EU's largest economy, well, does Germany still set the tone for the bloc's China policy? Is Germany gonna realign its stance toward the US or China? And what kind of ripple effects might this have for EU-China relations and the bloc's broader strategic direction when it comes to its relationship with China or the US?
Well, I mean, the European view on US took a big hit last week, or this week actually, because Trump was threatening to invade the European Union member state, Denmark, which is of course, I guess, more of a joke in a way. But it's just this kind of loose language, which makes it very hard for European politicians to actually A, forecast what Trump and US is going to do, and B, how to position themselves in this geopolitical game. We have definitely a new government in March, I guess. Friedrich Merz might be our chancellor, a guy who has a very good understanding of the United States. He knows lesser China. He was chairman of an American investment bank in Germany, and he is also definitely aware about the importance of the US market, importance of NATO for us, and so forth. So I guess there will be less of tension with him and Trump than there would be with Scholz and Trump, which definitely is not a good match. On China, I guess we have to see if Xi Jinping actually finds something which is alluring for Europeans, meaning stopping deliveries to the Ukrainian battlefields, talking to the North Koreans in order to withdraw the troops from Ukrainian battlefields. We have seen none of that. China has been fence-sitting plus aiding Russia to some extent, which of course is noticed across the whole European continent. So we have to really see it. But one thing is, I was in Berlin in November. There was big soul searching going on of what Trump is going to do. I think in this respect, we actually really don't know how to position ourselves as European towards Trump. It is much, much easier in order to deal with China and Xi Jinping, which is more predictable, yet of declining interest because of the economy, which is really limping along in China, as well as the overcapacities that might spill into third markets and causing havoc. But at the same time, Europe, in particular Germany and Italy, are very open for Chinese investment. And I think this trend line will continue. I think there are discussions going on about China buying into one of the Volkswagen factories. So in a way, there's still more room to maneuver between China and Europe. And on the US, again, we just have to see what happens.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And speaking of soul searching, Wendy, the EU has prided itself on upholding WTO compliance standards, even under trade pressures, as we saw previously. But now I'm hearing chatters in the other direction, with this mounting economic challenges, you might shift its stance or not. Do you see a scenario where that might actually happen? And what specific circumstances might push Brussels in that direction, away from WTO compliance standards?
Yeah, and this is one area where the U.S. position now with the EU has really, we're not aligned with the EU here, and that the EU insistence on whatever they do complies with the WTO, with its WTO obligations, is no longer a mantra for the United States. It was for many years, but the United States kind of woke up from the China challenge. I think the EU kind of insistence with compliance with WTO obligations has really impacted them negatively in two ways. One, I think it's really tied their hands with respect to responses to the China challenge. So, for example, on electric vehicles, the United States increased our tariff to 100%, and we used, Section 301 to do this. And I'm sure some countries, or I would think it's a matter of time before China probably sues us in the WTO. But the EU also, when it comes to cooperation with the United States on China issues, the WTO obligations has also tied the EU's hands. And here I refer to the collapse of the negotiations under the Biden administration between the US and EU on a green steel deal, and specifically on hiking tariffs against third countries such as China. So again, I understand why the EU is very wed to the WTO, to its WTO obligations. I think it's just a matter of time before the EU starts recognizing that it needs a little more flexibility here. And I think the flashpoint will probably be like it was in the United States, that there will be a real feeling that a strong response against EU imports, particularly those that are displacing local workers and putting local companies out of business, is going to become more front and center. And I think maybe a domestic concern about these the impacts of China on its economy will lead the public to be more aggressive with respect to the need for their politicians and governments to take stronger responses. And that may mean, again, going out of the rules of the WTO.
Right, and there's the one sentence of our discussion today. It's complicated, and it's quite clear that EU's balancing act is more complex and perhaps more critical than ever before. And with that,
I would just add also,
Sure.
let's just keep in mind, the WTO rules really have not been updated since China acceded to the WTO. So that was never the expectation. There was always an expectation there'd be new rounds and there'd be new new rules on emerging issues, including those impacting China. That has not happened. So we have a system in the WTO where China kind of can say it abides by the rules, but the rules don't really address the types of practices it follows, while other countries can feel bound to those rules. They're really at a disadvantage. And for me, that includes the EU here. So I think they need to do some soul searching.
Fantastic. And with that note, we will wrap up today's discussion. A huge thank you to Wendy, George, and Ilaria for sharing your expertise and insights. But the conversation on trade certainly does not stop here. And if you'd like to continue the discussion, continue our our exploration of the issue, please make sure you subscribe to Asia Society Policy Institute's social media channels, and do not hesitate to reach out with questions and comments. That concludes our short webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events.
Take care.